Now, from both sides of the aisle to this budget proposal, let's bring in Jason Furman from the Peterson Institute. He served as a top economic advisor to President Obama. And we have Romina Boccia from the Heritage Foundation joining us as well. Thank you both for joining us. Romina, I suspect the headlines tonight and tomorrow will be about the increases in defense spending and infrastructure as opposed to the cuts in entitlement programs. Is that a fair assessment of this budget? Do you feel that it is something that the taxpayers should come before the beneficiaries of some of these programs?
I think we have to have a proper balance between taxpayers and beneficiaries, and also between states and the local government. But I think what's missing from those headlines is the economic growth that this budget could bring about. If we cut the government down to size through tax reform and regulatory reform in this budget, we could bring the economy to grow, and that would benefit all Americans.
Jason, look, the budget's a tricky thing. It's effectively a political document, and it's almost like a party platform, right? What is the chance that this budget, that any budget, resembles the ultimate reality?
Oh, look, the ultimate reality won't resemble this budget, but this budget is the starting point for the president, and the president is an important player in any of the discussions we have. What's so striking to me is just a couple of years ago, there was a pretty broad consensus around something like the approach in Bowles-Simpson. And that had two ideas. One was that to deal with our deficit, you needed to put spending on the table and you needed to put revenues on the table. You needed to use both of those. And second of all, that we should do spending cuts without cutting spending for low-income and vulnerable populations. This budget really upends and reverses that whole idea behind Bowles-Simpson, the whole idea behind it, by making dramatic cuts in low-income programs, not to reduce the deficit, but to pay for tax cuts for some of the most fortunate households in our country. So I think it's a really bad starting point for a discussion.
Romina, what do you think?
So first of all, the budget operates off of a revenue-neutral baseline, so there is no tax cut when it comes to that. In terms of who suffers cuts, if you look at the overall welfare package between cash, food, housing, and other welfare assistance, the reductions are actually only about 7%. And it's not cutting anybody off, it's just asking for something in return. There's no more one-way handouts, but there are work requirements and community work if there is no work for those individuals to do. And what we found is that in Maine, when those policies were adopted, you found that all of a sudden the rolls dropped because people would just go off and get a job instead. And so this is a compassionate budget that tries to help people get back to work.
Jason, it is notable that the participation in the SNAP, the food stamp program, has not declined, even though even the broadest measures of the unemployment have improved significantly over the last couple of years. Does that indicate that there's a disconnect?
When it comes to the food stamp program, in part, the take-up rate, always a lot of families that were eligible weren't signing up for it. George W. Bush made it actually easier for them to sign up. In our administration, we did that as well, and that's part of what's going on there. But, to say that this budget isn't about a tax cut, this president went in his joint address to Congress and said he wanted to do a big, big tax cut. That was his words. He's proposed slashing tax rates. So this is a tax cut. The tax cut is disproportionately for the highest income households. And if we want to talk about work, absolutely. We need to do more to get more people to work. That's really important to our economic future. But the United States is, for example, among the lowest in the OECD in our budget for training and job search assistance. We need to be beefing up and investing more in areas like that if we want to help people work. This budget would actually cut those sorts of programs.
And before we go, very quickly, Romina, it assumes a growth rate of 3% by 2021, which has a lot of economists kind of running back to their abacus trying to figure out how you're going to achieve that. I mean, is that a realistic expectation for the economy, which is a cornerstone of this budget proposal, so that you can balance the budget at some point?
On its own, I don't think so, but when you look at the overall budget proposal, the regulatory, the tax reform, and the spending reforms, if the president were able to implement this entire agenda, I do think that 3% is reasonable. You would go back to historic trends. But given demographic factors and gridlock in Congress, I think it's less likely.
All right. Folks, thank you. I'm glad it was a calm debate. I'm tired of the rhetoric and the yelling. Thank you both for joining us today.